YouTube bound community, Bob Dylan fans, random people on the internet. My name is Giggens, and we are here today to talk about Bob Dylan's 1970 album, New Morning, released on Columbia Records on October 19th, 1970. This album has definitely been seen as like a return to form of sorts, even before Blood on the Tracks came out a few years later. In the sense that in the late 60s, Bob kind of took on a country-tinged voice, especially on Nashville Skyline and throughout much of the Self-Portrait album. But when Self-Portrait came out in earlier 1970, not even that early, it was like 4 months before this thing came out, it was pretty panned. A lot of people hated it. They thought it was a piece of crap. That was one of Bob's worst albums. And so literally this thing came out 4 months later, and so many people saw it as like, well, I guess Bob jumped into the studio to like rip these songs out and make a better album. Not true. He was already working on this thing when Self-Portrait was already on the way out. So like he was already in the studio doing new stuff. Most of this album was recorded at the Columbia Studios in New York City in the summer of 1970. A lot of it was done like within 1 week, minus a couple of songs here and there. But he recorded a ton of stuff for this album, including a bunch of covers. Some of which were highly thought to be considered to be on the album itself, but in the end, they went for it all Bob Dylan album. Really, this is one of my favorite Bob Dylan albums ever. This one and Nashville Skyline have to be easily in my top 5. I really like Dylan's voice at this point. He stopped the country sort of thing that Nashville Skyline had, and Self-Portrait. It kind of just went to like his own sort of voice. He doesn't sound exactly like the Bob Dylan of Rainy Day Woman or Highway 61, but like he sounds comfortable and relaxed and not really caring about what people think, which is totally Bob Dylan anyway, but it really works. This makes for a really effective album, and I really like that most of this album is piano-based. That, you know, for a guy that's always playing the guitar, to hear him play piano, he's a really good piano player. And he does it on a bunch of the songs on this thing. It makes for a really, really interesting, retrospective, fascinating listen to kind of get an idea of what his psyche was like at this point in time. So yeah, I love the cover on this thing. It's just Bob kind of, you know, looking out. Hello. There's a great review when this thing came out in 1970 from Rolling Stone. And the guy who wrote it was saying, the picture on the cover basically looks like Bob Dylan saying, oh yeah, you thought my last one sucked? Well, try this one out. This one's really good. I got a look that says, like, you're not going to hate this. And he's kind of got that look. He's kind of scruffy, he's got a beard, his hair's shaggy. Really cool. Really cool album cover there, Bob. But yeah, fantastic, fantastic album. So it opens up with a song called If Not For You, and if you're a George Harrison fan, you're familiar with this song because they wrote it together. There's a really, really early version of the song where George actually plays on Bob Dylan's version, but that wasn't released till like the early 90s. It's not on, he doesn't play on this album, but it's funny how on this record he's credited as the only writer on that song. It just says Bob Dylan, which I'm pretty sure was a co-write, if I remember correctly. I could be totally wrong, but I really remember it being that way. And it's also funny because George put his out a month later in November with All Things Must Pass. So it's cool to have two versions of the same song at the same era, you know, both around the fall of 1970. But, you know, Dylan's voice in this song is really relaxed, it's comfortable, it's really solid, and his harmonica breaks are totally classic Dylan. I love those breaks. The instrumentation is what I would describe as polite. It's delicate. And it's also really endearing. You know, there's a lot of really nice guitar licks that pop up here and there, and they give the song a nice touch. You know, Bob's voice is really sweet, and the sentiment of the song is no longer, you know, like a yearning for somebody. It's like having that person and being super comfortable with them and realizing that, like, yeah, a lot of things in my life would suck if you weren't here. So, like, this is a great thing we have going on here, and it's nice to hear that. It's a really positive sort of vibe. But great way to start the album off. I love the little intro that it's got. And there's some heavy players on this thing. You got Dave Brownberg and Al Kooper and Charlie Daniels. I mean, there's a lot of people on this album. Day of the Locusts is the next track. And I love this track. This has always been one of my favorites. Really love the piano on this thing. Sort of a gospel influence in the piano playing here for sure. And it's a total earworm. It's a story about Bob Dylan going to get his honorary doctorate from Princeton and the journey of going there and how much he hated being there. And how awkward it all was. He went there with his wife Sarah and David Crosby, And both Sarah and David Crosby were like, look, you got to go to this thing. And Bob Dylan just like hesitated to the last minute. There, he was like, all right, fine, I'll go. And he got there, and they were like, hey, you got to wear this cap and gown. He was like, this sucks. I don't want to do it. And they were like, well, you won't get this diploma if you don't do it. And so Bob's answer was something along the lines of like, well, I didn't want it anyway. So he put the thing on. And the Locusts were out there. It was those things where the cicadas come out every 17 years, and they were just like in hordes at this point. So yeah, it's fun because I love the Locust sound in the background. You lead vocal solo by the Locusts. And the little like crying guitar fills that happen throughout this thing are really cool. But I also really like the story about, the guy's head was exploding. Apparently, years later, David Crosby said that was about him. That line was about him, being with Dylan during that time. Time passes slowly. This is one of my favorites on here too. I love the piano work on this track. Really, really cool piano work. But Dylan's rock voice is so fun. Like when he just lets loose and doesn't care about his like aesthetic, or just doesn't care about like what people might think and just goes for it. I think that's the best Dylan that we get. There's some, I could really see the Black Crowes doing this song. It's got the elements and the guts to make a really good Black Crowes song. Like they did a great job with Hard to Handle, the Otis Redding song. So I can see them doing that. I like the quiet rhythm underneath it all. There's drums there, but not like super heavy drums. They're just kind of in the background, bubbling around. But the touches throughout this thing of different elements of the organ or the guitar kind of sweeping in and blending in with the rest of the other instruments, that happens throughout much of this album. A lot of it does feel kind of like a jam with a bunch of talented people who know how to riff off each other. And that makes for a very interesting listen. And they fill in the different parts of the song, and they work with the lyrics and the way Bob's singing, so it works really well. But this song in particular, I love the melody of this track for sure. I Went to See the Gypsy's a cool song. This is another like really heavy piano-driven song. It's apparently not about meeting Elvis. For years, people thought that's what it was. But in Bob Dylan's Chronicles book, Volume 1, he mentioned that, no, it's not about Elvis. It's about meeting somebody, either famous or some sort of person of interest, and the stories they created together, and then going back to see that person, but that person had left and took everybody else with him or her and was gone. Very interesting song. He also mentions a small little town in Minnesota, so it might be a reference to Hibbing, where he grew up. But yeah, cool song. Really enjoy that one. Winterlude, it's kind of a goofy little song. It's definitely got like almost a vaudevillian-esque deal with it. It's about a girl named Winterlude and how this dude thinks you're fine. Like, it kind of works because it's like a slight reprieve from like the heavier stuff that's happened so far. But it's also kind of fun. It's not, I don't think it's meant to be taken super seriously, but I kind of like the vibe it gives off. It stays in your head for sure. The whole like, Winterlude, Winterlude. I mean, it sounds like an old 30s song or something. Not my favorite on the album, but easily not the worst thing he's ever done. Then you get If Dogs Run Free. This song is absolutely awesome. Totally like a blues, jazz, smoky club kind of feel. It really, really like the acoustic guitars and then the background electric guitars that kind of like hang out really in the distance but make their presence known. Bob's voice is so dedicated to the element of this genre, and the way he portrays the lyrics and the storytelling really is a cool little accent against music he hasn't really dabbled in before. I like that a lot. I love the scat singing by, I think her name is Martha Stewart. She has a really cool element to this track with her scat singing, jumping in just at the right time to give a cool little element to Bob's performance here. But great track. Really cool way to end side one. Side 2 starts off with the title track, New Morning, which is easily one of the happiest songs Bob Dylan's ever written. The guitars are back. All of a sudden, this is a guitar song. After side 1 being mostly dominated by piano, here are the guitars again. But it's a nice, like, country life kind of song. It's a really light song. The melody is really, really sweet. There's some wonderful moments that ascend and descend, and I'm a sucker for that kind of stuff. It's just fun to follow that momentum up and down. But those moments lead to a very joyous chorus. I mean, new morning. It's like you hear him like singing from the mountains. Like it's just a really great, happy melody. Dylan's just singing his head off throughout this thing. The organ swells that happen throughout this track are fantastic. The overall sunshine of the performance is outstanding. It's really easily one of Dylan's happiest songs, and I think a great way to name an album, because it is kind of like a fresh start. Every new day is a fresh start. So maybe I think a lot of people also saw it as like, well, self-portrait was yesterday. Here's the next chapter. Here's the new morning from Bob Dylan. It's super catchy. Easily one of the highlights of this album. Sign on the Window. This is another really, really good song. Dylan's voice in this one's pretty emotional, and I like that like tinge to his voice. It's a little more introspective in a world-weary, I've lived some years kind of way. His voice hits a lot of tender moments, which I think is a cool change. And there's also moments in the middle of the song where he shakes it up with a couple of key changes. Not necessarily full key changes, but he just kind of changes some things around. I can totally see Jack White doing this song. I can totally see Jack White at the piano banging this thing out. Yeah, totally up his alley for sure. I love the sparse drums. I love the flutes that kind of sprinkle throughout this thing. The little touches of bass here and there. There's moments where like the band swells up and then disappears again. And I like that atmosphere. That dynamic is fun to listen to. It makes for a really compelling performance and easily a classic of this era for Bob Dylan. No problem there. Which leads you to One More Weekend, which is just like the complete opposite of this song. Like something that was so heavy and dense, you get to this cool rocker that's straight out of the 60s Dylan songbook, straight out of Highway 61, straight out of Blonde on Blonde. Even something I would say would be on Nashville Skyline for sure. A great, fun song. It's totally a rocker. It's a blues jam. There's some shaky rhythm guitars that almost sound like For You Blue on Let It Bleed. Wrong band, right album. Or vice versa. You know what I'm talking about. The really sharp soloing on this thing is cool. It's fun because the drums on this one, I think, shine a little more than on the rest of the album. I think the drums get a little bit more of a presence on this song. That's because it's just a straight up jam. I mean, it's a rocker. So, very cool track. The Man in Me, this is an interesting song too. I like the spirit of this one. It's got a really nice message, basically saying like, hey, like there's only one girl in my life that can, make sense of this, and you're the one. The real earnest quality in his delivery, the appreciation, the devotion in his voice. The lyrics are heartwarming. It's a really endearing track. It's just a nice song about appreciating somebody who appreciates who you are. And that's hard to find in this world. Somebody like really digs every single thing about you and you feel the same way about them. So those kind of songs are always appealing, and I think that's something nice to see from Bob Dylan. It's a good, for me, that's a continuation of Nashville Skyline, where there's so many love songs on that album that are really like, as if for Brian Wilson fans, it's like a slice of life kind of song, where it's like, here's a moment in time, here's what we're going through, here's how much I care about this person, and that's it. Three Angels, this is an interesting track. These last two songs are interesting. They don't necessarily, for me, I understand them and I appreciate them, but they're not the most grabbing songs for me. Maybe in time I'll change my opinion on that, but Three Angels is a really interesting song because it's very much a storytelling song about three angels watching like daily life happening, and basically going through the motions that people go through. It kind of plods along like in a slow motion kind of way. It's not the longest song either, but it's definitely a storytelling song. It's meant to be, the music's kind of taking the back burner approach here, and you're kind of just listening to the lyrics in this one. Not my favorite, but not terrible. The Father of Night is actually an interpretation of a Jewish poem that he put to music that Manfred Mann actually redid for one of their albums in the mid-'70s. The excellent piano playing on that song, for sure. Excellent piano playing. The backup vocals on that one are absolutely fantastic. Again, not my favorite song, but definitely a lot of work went into this thing. So, overall, this album really is fantastic. And it says the producer is Bob Johnson. It's mostly Al Kooper. Bob Johnson kind of faded in and out at this point. He worked with Dylan for a long time, but by this point, it kind of like faded out a little bit. And Al Kooper, I think, was super upset with Bob Dylan at this point, too, because like they would go into the studio, have an idea for a song, do it, Dylan would change his mind, do something else, Al would show him something he did, Dylan wouldn't pay attention to it. It was a back and forth there of kind of a struggle. And during this time, Dylan also broke his ties with Albert Grossman, his manager. and kind of severed that whole thing. But so this is a very interesting era for Bob Dylan, especially what would come next with some of his other albums leading up to Blood on the Tracks, which is highly regarded as one of his best albums of all time. But this thing did really well for itself when it came out. It hit number 7 in the US and went gold. It went to number 1 in the UK, which I think was his last number 1 there until Together Through Life came out, whenever that was, 2009 or 10, 2009. So it did really well for itself at that time. As far as like the life this thing has had since then, I honestly would say it's pretty forgotten about. I mean, he hasn't really played anything from this album. He's played like 4 songs from this thing. One of them was debuted around 2000, so I mean, it's like he's got a lot of work to pick from. But yeah, really, this also has the shrink on it still, which is pretty cool. It's open, but it's got the shrink. So you get a picture of 1970 Dylan, and then you get a picture of like 1962, 63 Dylan in New York. I think he's in New York here. I can't remember. But it's a good shot of him there. And the track list. And I'll show you the label. Nothing crazy to write home about in this thing. It's the Columbia label of the time. They started doing this setup here. But yeah, I'm always been fascinated by this era of Bob Dylan. I'll probably review Self-Portrait at some point. I really want to pick up that bootleg series of the Self-Portrait era stuff because apparently that's even better than the actual album. So I'd be interested to see that. But yeah, this album is absolutely fantastic. I'd probably give this thing a 7 or 8 out of 10. It's got some of my favorite songs on it. I think Went to See the Gypsy is great. Time Passes Slowly. Day of the Locusts. Sun in the Window. New Morning. I mean, like, there's a lot of classics on this thing. So, yeah, let's go with a 7. No, let's go with an 8 out of 10. I'm going to give Bob Dylan an 8 out of 10 on this one. So, yeah, that's it. Let me know what you guys think about this thing because I don't think it's a super memorable album in terms of Bob Dylan's output. I think this is one of his more forgotten ones. May have been big at the time, but, you know, if you ask someone what their favorite Bob Dylan song is from New Morning, they're going to say, what? So, yeah, that's it. My name is Giggens. This has been Album Reviews with Bob Dylan, New Morning, 8 out of 10. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye-bye.